A lot of people love watching series and movies set in a post-apocalyptic world and treat that lifestyle as something glorious and full of adventure. You see the characters running free through abandoned cities, finding hidden supplies, forming loyal groups, and facing dangers with a courage that almost seems fun. The clothes are torn in just the right way, the hair is messy in just the right way, and even in the middle of total destruction, everyone seems to be living something grand. But the truth is that reality in a world like that would be completely different from everything Hollywood shows on screen. Most of the things that seem exciting in movies would either be impossible or simply non existent in a real situation of total societal collapse. What would remain would be a daily grind, heavy, exhausting, and full of suffering that very few people would be prepared to face. The first big lie that movies sell is the idea that horses would be the main form of transportation in a world without fuel. You see the heroes galloping down empty roads with the wind in their hair like modern cowboys, and it looks very beautiful on screen. But anyone who thinks a little more seriously about it will realize that keeping a horse alive requires an enormous amount of food, water, and daily care. In a society where people are starving and struggling to find anything to eat, sacrificing precious resources to feed a large animal like that makes no sense whatsoever. The brutal logic of survival would turn horses into a source of meat rather than a means of transportation. Today, we have multi-gear bicycles that can cover hundreds of miles with far less caloric effort and without needing feed or a vet to keep them running. Another point that movies completely ignore is that long journeys would be rare events and not routine adventures. In movies, the group of survivors is always on the move, crossing entire states, traversing deserts, and arriving at new places every episode as if traveling were something easy and natural. But in practice, whoever lived in an area with enough resources to survive would have far more to lose than to gain by leaving. The uncertainty of not knowing what exists on the other side would be paralyzing. You would not know if the next territory has food, if the people there are friendly or hostile, if the road is impassable or full of danger. Most people would stay within a few miles of where they lived and would get to know their closest neighbors very well because they would depend on them to survive. Journeys would only be made in cases of extreme necessity and not as part of a life full of adventures. The issue of hygiene and beauty products is another area where movies get it badly wrong. Characters who spend weeks in the middle of the forest without access to anything appear on screen with shiny hair, clean skin, and even flawless makeup as if they had just walked out of a salon. In reality, washing your body and clothes properly without soap would already be an enormous challenge. Maintaining any kind of personal hygiene routine beyond the bare minimum would be a luxury that most people simply would not have the means to afford. Beauty products, shampoo, conditioner, and cosmetics would be the last items on the priority list in a society trying to rebuild itself from scratch. Even in the most organized and prosperous communities, it would take a very long time before anyone had the energy to think about anything other than food, safety, and shelter. And whoever spent their days in the fields or the forest simply would not look like a Hollywood model, regardless of any effort made. A silent danger that few movies show realistically is that of diseases and medical ignorance that would come roaring back in a world without infrastructure. Today, we already have serious problems with people who refuse to vaccinate their children, even with all the available information and with functioning healthcare systems. Imagine what that would look like in a world where laws practically do not exist, where vaccines disappear, and where mass communication stops working. Misinformation would spread far faster than any vaccine could reach people. Diseases that we consider controlled today would come back to kill in massive numbers because there would not be enough organization to ensure that populations were immunized. Measles, tuberculosis, cholera, and dozens of other diseases that the modern world learned to control would return with a violence that would wipe out entire communities before anyone understood what was happening. And speaking of health, the pollution problem would be far more serious than any post-apocalyptic movie usually shows. Today we have laws, regulatory agencies, and international agreements that try to at least control the damage we cause to the environment, even if imperfectly. Without any of that, each community would handle its own waste however it wanted, and those downstream would pay the price for what those upstream dumped in the water. Even worse, people would have enough industrial knowledge to improvise equipment and use dangerous chemicals, but would have no environmental safety structure to control the damage. The result would be local contamination far more intense than anything the pre-industrial world ever experienced. The combination of fragmented technical knowledge with a total absence of regulation would create a silent environmental disaster that would poison water sources and soil in communities before anyone noticed the full extent of the damage. One of the things the modern world has spoiled us with is the ease of always finding people who think like us. On the internet, you can find groups for any interest, no matter how specific. There is always someone agreeing with your opinions and validating your daily choices. This has created an entire generation accustomed to this constant confirmation that they are right about everything they think and do. In a post-apocalyptic world, that comfort would disappear completely overnight. You would have to live with the people who are physically around you, regardless of whether you have anything in common with them or not. Your neighbor might have completely opposite views to yours on politics, religion, raising children, and ways to organize the community. But you would need to learn to work with them anyway, because survival would depend on that forced cooperation. The more specific hobbies and interests that seem normal today because there is always someone online to share them with would simply have no place in this new reality. That person passionate about comic books, board games, astronomy, or any cultural niche that exists in abundance on the internet would find themselves completely alone within, several miles of where they live. Without a digital connection, there is no longer that feeling of belonging to a community of people who understand your references and share your passions. You would go back to being that strange person who likes things that nobody around understands or cares about. And worse than that, you would not even have time to dedicate to those interests because the hours of the day would be completely taken up by the struggle to get food, maintain, shelter, and ensure the safety of the group. The cultural and intellectual life that we consider basic today would be an inaccessible luxury for most people. The medical problem would perhaps be the cruelest of all because it would affect everyone without distinction of strength or physical preparation. In movies, characters get stabbed, shot, take violent falls and serious blows, but always recover with an improvised bandage and a good night of sleep. In reality, a poorly treated cut, a simple fracture, or a bacterial infection that today is resolved with antibiotics could easily become a death sentence. Without access to medications, without trained health professionals, and without hospital infrastructure, the human body becomes completely vulnerable to things we consider minor problems today. A toothache that went untreated could develop into an infection that reached the brain and killed within a matter of days. Diseases that are treated today with cheap pills would once again kill young healthy adults the same way they killed in the 19th century. Anyone who ended up with a permanent disability because of a poorly treated accident or illness would face an even greater challenge than the physical limitation itself. In a society focused entirely on production and collective survival, every person would need to contribute in a concrete way to justify consuming the group's resources. Someone who could not work in the fields, carry weight, stand night watch, or perform any essential physical task would be seen as a burden by the more practical members of the community. This does not mean that people would necessarily become cruel or without compassion, but the economic pressure of scarcity would create morally very difficult situations that movies avoid showing. Communities with few resources would have to make painful choices about how to distribute what they have, and who would get priority for the scarce medical care available would be an agonizing question with no easy answer. The question of children would also be completely different from what anyone today is used to thinking about. With infant mortality skyrocketing due to lack of medical care, and with urgent need for labor, families would go back to having many children, as was common centuries ago, not out of romantic choice, but out of practical necessity. Children as young as 5 or 6 would already be helping with field tasks, caring for animals, or doing essential domestic work because every pair of hands would count. Formal education would cease to be a priority because learning to plant, harvest, build, and defend would be far more urgent than learning to read or do math. The emotional bond between parents and children would not disappear, but would be hardened by the reality of knowing that many of those children would not reach adulthood and that getting too attached would be a source of constant and paralyzing pain. Violence would be a constant presence and not an occasional event as movies tend to portray. Any community that managed to accumulate resources, whether food, tools, seeds, or clean water, would automatically become a target for desperate groups willing to take what they needed by force. It would not be just lone criminals or villains with elaborate motivations like in the movies. It would be hungry families, fathers trying to feed children, ordinary people who had reached a point of desperation where morality bends in the face of necessity. Small farms and isolated families would be the most vulnerable because they would not have enough people to mount an effective defense. Larger communities with organized protection systems would have a better chance, but even they would live in a permanent state of alert that would physically and psychologically exhaust all members over time. The fantasy that many young people nurture about a post-apocalyptic world is one of total freedom. No rules, no bosses, no obligations. The idea of being able to do whatever you want whenever you want with no law to stop you seems seductive, especially for those who feel suffocated by the demands of modern life. But the reality would be exactly the opposite of that. Instead of a world without rules, what would emerge would be a world full of new rules created by each community from scratch and far more rigid than any law that exists today. Whoever arrived in a territory controlled by a group would have to follow that group's norms or be expelled immediately. There would be no court to appeal to, no lawyer to defend you, and no second chance in most cases. The freedom that seems so attractive in movies would in practice be a dangerous solitude and a constant vulnerability. The loner who tried to live entirely on their own without joining any community would be the one with the shortest and hardest life of all. In movies, the lone wolf always manages to get by, finds what they need, escapes the dangers, and even occasionally saves some helpless group. But in real life, a single person without support cannot stand watch while sleeping, cannot take care of themselves when sick, cannot plant and harvest and defend the harvest all at the same time. Any group of 3 or 4 poorly organized people would have an enormous advantage over the most prepared of loners, because human cooperation is what has always made the difference between surviving and not surviving. The entire evolution of the human species was built on the idea of working together, and any attempt to deny that in a scenario of total collapse would be fatal within a matter of weeks or months. Communities that managed to organize well would be the only ones with a real chance of prospering, but even those would face enormous internal challenges that movies rarely show. Honestly. Deciding who leads, how to distribute work, how to punish those who break the rules, how to treat the sick and the elderly, how to deal with couples who fight or with people who steal within the group are issues that tear entire communities apart, even today with all the institutional structure available. Without written laws, without impartial judges, and without organized police force, these decisions would fall into the hands of whoever had the most physical strength or the most personal influence over the group. The result would inevitably be some form of hierarchy based on power, and not necessarily on wisdom or justice. And whoever ended up on the weak side of that hierarchy would suffer consequences that no entertainment film would have the courage to show in detail. Mental health would be another silent disaster that would destroy people from the inside long before any external threat could reach them. Modern humans already struggle with anxiety, depression, and trauma under relatively comfortable conditions with access to therapy, medication, and social support networks. Imagine the psychological weight of living in a permanent state of alert, of having lost loved ones, of not knowing if there will be food tomorrow, of witnessing violence up close, and of carrying the weight of impossible decisions every single day. Without psychologists, without psychiatric medication, and without any emotional support structure, people would simply break down on the inside and continue functioning on the outside like ghosts of themselves. The accumulated trauma of generations living under those conditions would create wounds that would take decades to begin healing, even after the situation improved. The rebuilding of any kind of organized society would take far longer than any movie suggests, and the path would be full of painful setbacks. Movies love to show that final scene where the community is planting, building, smiling, and clearly heading in the right direction after overcoming the big villain of the story. But the real history of humanity shows that societies take generations to rebuild after serious collapses, and that the process is full of internal wars, famine, disease, and setbacks that destroy in weeks what took years to build. Every unexpected drought, every new epidemic, every conflict with the neighboring community would be capable of wiping out years of progress and throwing everyone back to square one. Human resilience is real, but it manifests over a much longer and more painful timeline than 2 hours of film can capture. In the end, what the post-apocalyptic fantasy reveals is not so much a desire for the end of the world, but a deep dissatisfaction with the life we have right now. The idea of starting from scratch, of having clear purpose, of depending on real skills, and of belonging to a group united by genuine need speaks to something that many people feel is missing in the modern world full of comfort and empty of meaning. But the answer to that emptiness is not to romanticize suffering or fantasize about the collapse of everything humanity has built with so much sacrifice over centuries. The answer lies in finding within the life we already have the elements that make an existence worthwhile: community, purpose, real work, and genuine human connections. The apocalypse would not be a liberation. It would simply be the most brutal and cruel version of the same problems we already face today, only without any of the tools we have developed to deal with them.